Welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. It's a really great pleasure for me to have with us today one of the key backers and people who assist this program in Susanna. Thanks very much for being here, Susanna. Really appreciate all the work you've put into supporting the program. And we're going to have a situation today where I get the tables turned on me. So thanks very much for helping out with this, and over to you.
It's been my pleasure, Mike. This is a really exciting journey. All right, so we are turning the tables on Mike Kelly today. Let's start at the beginning. All right, your career spans military, politics, strategic analysis. Who is Mike Kelly?
Yeah, I guess we're all products of our experiences and our backgrounds. So I guess I'm a product of and have had the benefit from a lot of, I guess, experiences that have given me scar tissue that I try and draw on. Not claiming any kind of genius status or sainthood, but just the fact that we have these life experiences that I think a lot of us would like to be able to make use of and pass on lessons learned from.
So you're a really complex and influential figure. What drives you to continue to, after your whole career, to continue to be involved in geopolitics and trying to unravel that for the everyday Australian?
Partly comes with the family territory. Like every generation of the family has contributed to our national security. We've got my grandfather up there in Benjamin Joseph Kelly, who was very influential in my life, and he served the country in the Second World War and fighting in Syria and Lebanon and then in Java, and then as a prisoner of war of the Japanese.
Yeah, wow.
On the Burma Thai Railway. He was a great man, really taught you resilience, but also it put everything you might go through in perspective, and still to this day with his loincloth, I might pull that out if I think I'm doing it tough and say, like, harden up, sunshine. But
You're
also
incredible.
Oh, yeah, it's just when you think about that generation and what they went through from, he lived through the Spanish influenza, the Depression, World War II, etc. Was born before the First World War. So, it helps us, I think, keep things in perspective. But all of these generations from the past who, helped build the region that we were settled in Australia, in the Bega Valley, etc.
The freedoms we have today.
Yeah, building, but contributing in other ways too, building hospitals and the rest of it. So, it makes you, and it was always a part of that family history, that you've got to put something back into the country. And because it's such a beautiful place and provides us with our freedom, that has to be defended and fought for sometimes. So that was a central theme.
Doesn't come without its responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people join the military for lots of different reasons, for duty, honour, adventure. What was it that motivated you, Mike?
Well, it was that family history first and foremost, the passing of the slouch hat.
Was it the adrenaline?
Look, always interested in adventure, that's for sure. As a young bloke, you're an idiot. So there's that dimension of it, I guess. But you also want to contribute, to that family story, and you do understand it if it's passed down to you like that. It does become real to you. So
I think you'd be really proud of you, Mike.
Well, the main thing is that you don't want to finish your life and look back on it and say, "Oh, I didn't make the most of it."
Yeah.
And the lesson I draw from these veterans and that generation, whether they served in wars or not, is that, am I worthy of the sacrifice they made and the ones that didn't make it, particularly? And have I made the most of the opportunities they gave me? And if I ask myself that question every day, then you can't find a better rule to measure your contribution or create your motivation.
Yeah. Yeah. So when did you first realise that war wasn't fought with just bullets and perceptions, but it was about narratives and disinformation? And we're going to dive into this in future programs. But we've been talking a lot about perceptions of how people think war begins and why it begins. But there's those other complexities with the narratives.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think of war as like, it's all about these assets, tanks and planes, or it's a game of Risk or whatever. And war is first and foremost, it's about humans, and about the 2 inches up here, what
Mm.
goes on in a human head, to create these kind of violent situations in the first place. But also around a war will be wrapped multiple levels of complexity, even in the most straightforward situations of good versus evil, like our confrontation with Nazi Germany, for example. There's still multiple levels of complexity around that. What are the dynamics that have gone around, how they got there, how they're
Mm.
interacting with other European countries, and the cultural and social issues there, and how we work with that. That always is at play whenever you're dealing with what they might call the human terrain.
Yeah.
And so my background in the army was mainly in contesting spaces around counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, where you have to really understand that human dimension and how to work with it and how to bring it to bear and find the good elements to promote.
Mm.
So in many ways, it's like playing 3D chess. And, if you're not conducting your more geopolitical activities as a government and as a defence force, fully stitched up with all of that, that you're looking towards the holistic end state you want to achieve, and how do you create like a whole of government, and even outside of government these days with NGOs and whatnot, how do you harness all of that to get to that holistic end state?
Yes. Wow. It's so complex, I imagine, in the modern world too, where the media has such a role to play as well in crafting that narrative.
Absolutely spot on. Technology has made a real difference to
Mm.
another layer of complexity here. And we're going to talk about this in future episodes and how it plays out practically in many of the contested spaces in the world. But particularly in the information side of things, with the development of social media and the algorithms that feed that, the confirming bias sort of trends in relation to all that creates the polarization, that makes it hard for you to connect with the peoples of the world when,
Mm.
you're not fighting on the same
Yeah.
level playing field.
Affects our civil discourse with one another.
Absolutely, even domestically here, because the efforts of malign actors plays out in our own space here, even within our what we would think is a sophisticated liberal democracy. Our openness and our democracy sometimes makes us vulnerable to these
Yeah.
things. So we have to find good compromises or means of tackling these issues that don't threaten what it is we're actually trying to defend in the first place.
Mm.
So, finding the
That
right
freedom has
balance.
the fragility.
Yeah, and you don't sacrifice the freedom to defend the freedom. Like I guess it's a take on the old saying, we had to destroy the village in order to save it.
Yeah.
So
It reminds me, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
yeah, that's right on every level.
Mm.
And you have to look carefully at this social license. And I think of my grandfather's generation and how there were so many points of potential failure and so many huge trials and tribulations along the way, where it would have been so easy for the social compact there to fall apart
Mm.
on continuing to make the commitment and not run up the white flag. So that resilience to
Yeah,
fight
so
through the
resilient.
downsides of whatever you're doing and live through that and persevere. The ability to persevere these days is something that I think is going to be a real challenge when we need to draw on that resource.
Well, that's what you're here for, Mike.
Got to try.
So we're going to dive into your career a little bit so that our listeners who aren't familiar with your career learn a little bit more about you. You've served in places such as Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, East Timor, and even a hostage scenario in Kenya. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's a real blessing in one way, in that, notwithstanding the downsides of all of it, and some of the legacy issues it leaves with you, having experienced operations in Africa, in Europe, in the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific in particular, really gave me a perspective on the general themes that are important to humans, and the themes that, will be the same everywhere you go. And really taught me so much about needing to understand cultural context whenever you're there, and doing your work beforehand to try and prep yourself for that, and then making the time and the effort before you go into crockery shops and breaking things to really understand what the situation is now, and how you use the cultural hooks that exist, etc., and all those things, particularly in that kind of counterinsurgency situation. But
So how do you lead in those impossible situations?
yeah, look, they're challenging environments, and I think, first ran into that as a serious issue in the Australian Defence Force in the war in Vietnam, where very hard to distinguish between your threat and the civil population. That's a deliberate effort on the part of the people you're confronting. And understanding the political framework and context for all of that's so important to address and redress at times as well. You can't have a military or even an aid effort operating on the ground without addressing that back-end political framework as well. It's all got to be stitched up for there to be success. Otherwise, and we found so many times, for a while there, Australians were getting given a province to work with. So, in Vietnam, you had the Phuoc Toi province, and then, when we were in Somalia, we had the Bai province, and then in Iraq, Multana, and then Tarin Nurazgan province in Afghanistan. And you can do a wonderful job, and Australians often do a really good job at adjusting to their environment and tactically working out a good way forward. But if the global strategic picture is not marching alongside with you there will ultimately be strategic failure.
Yeah, wow. So you've served on multiple continents with different worldviews and totally different ways of life. How do you reconcile the stark differences between those continents and environments?
Well, there will be these other factors that you plug in behind basic human needs. So there's like the Maslow's hierarchy of human need, and that's a good place to always start. You'll be in a situation where people just, don't want to be killed, or they don't want to be raped, etc., or they want to be fed. And so you can address those. They're fairly straightforward. But then you start, as you move through addressing those needs, then you'll get all these other cultural, religious, ideological complexities come into play.
Imagine some of those are things that are just totally foreign that would never cross our mind.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone coming from the West who's never experienced, another culture, it will be difficult. It will be a shock. You'll have your own cultural reference.
Offending people without realizing. And
yeah, absolutely. And I've seen it, when you do confront people who haven't had any and aren't really interested in understanding the culture and think their culture's, it's superior in every way, and therefore it's going to be my way or the highway. And sometimes that's a really subtle thing. Like, we all think that democracy is the best form of government, and frankly, it is. But how do you actually build a culture of democracy?
yeah,
Right?
we never get anywhere with people by being condescending.
No, or applying structures that haven't drawn on the cultural references,
Yep.
right? So we just bring in, you got to have an election, and then there's legislation, and then there's these structures. It's like in a lot of the environments I was in, you had these local traditions of dispute resolution, like the DIA system in Somalia or the Gachaka.
What's the DIA system?
So these are ways you can resolve disputes in communities by bringing together like a council of elders or whatever, and you can come to a mutual satisfactory result. It doesn't involve expensive lawyers and, etc.
Sounds very practical.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of merit in it, frankly. And things that we should adopt out of that, like I think of our family law situations where you bring in this adversarial sort of framework.
I
And
think
lots
that's
of
an
lawyers.
episode of its own.
Yes, absolutely. So, but, as I say, elections and laws are not unimportant, but it's the culture of democracy you have to build, and that doesn't happen overnight. It takes like a generational thing. So you have to be patient with that. You have to find ways to engage and build people-to-people contact, to build civil society, and have the incentives and the peace dividends attached to all of that. They see the benefit of doing things in this particular way, and then take those cultural references and
buying.
and make them, like something that you can build on to achieve that result. And be patient with it.
So how do you maintain your own personal convictions, particularly when you've got competing objectives, and which could be someone else's, whether they're ego-driven or pursuing power? How do you maintain your equilibrium and your convictions in
It's
all
really
of that?
tough and confrontational at times, right? So in certain very conservative societies, you will see things around the treatment of women, for example,
Yeah.
very commonly, like, genital mutilation practices, or
Just finished reading Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book. It's just,
yeah,
wow,
and
what a woman.
exactly, but they're confrontational, and then there's a whole range of issues that are associated with certain cultures that we find really shocking, and frankly, they are. We've kind of moved on from a
Horrific.
lot of things. We don't stone people to death anymore, etc. Even though that's referenced in some of our religious traditions, etc.
Well, to be fair, I think
texts.
I'd rather be turned into a rock pile than undergo FGM.
Well, I'd prefer neither, frankly. And I don't want to see either happening. But
horrific.
so it's that's something that you get that initial shock, and you say, well, we can't accept that.
No.
But so you might want to move immediately to try and address things like mutilation, genital mutilation, but you have to find a way to bring people along on that journey, and sometimes you can't do it overnight.
No.
You've got to sort of accept things for a while you get the main things sorted out, and then be patient with finding your way out of that stuff. So
Gosh, that's really hard.
yeah, it is, and it's difficult because you find it confronting, but it's also important not to accept it.
The human cost.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some people think, well, we're going to allow women to be treated this way, or gay and lesbian men and women, it's okay for them to be killed or whatever, because that's anything else is cultural imperialism. But that's we have to maintain our belief that some things are unacceptable, and that you want to move people away
Child
from that.
marriage and abuse of children.
Yes.
How can you just stand by and...
Well, that's right, and
No.
so, and then of course, you have to confront these othering processes, and I've seen it so many times. A lot of my army career was actually just spent defending Muslims from other Muslims. So you see, even within what you think is a construct of, where there might be a mutual identity or consent, but there's not.
It's not
So
cohesive.
there's obviously the really big divide between Shia and Sunni, for example, and then you get all the normal power politics and personal gain issues that people will leverage or try and exploit what is a religious or other political ideology, and that's just a front for their ambitions for power and wealth, etc. So unpacking all that, but doing it in a way that doesn't attack some of the fundamentals there that you need to work with.
Gosh, it is three
that ain't
digits,
easy,
isn't it?
and you're never going to get it all right either. So
No.
and it's a question of, if you do make a mistake, or if you find you've trodden on toes, how do you recover from that too?
So often we think that in very simple terms that war is about ideology, or different cultures form the ideology is the framework of the culture, and we think democracy versus dictatorship, or good versus evil. But from your perspective, is that just convenient thinking? Does that make us feel better about ourselves?
It's the problem with it is being binary,
Yep.
black and white, and unfortunately our media often plays into this, because they're
Easy
trying.
button to press.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I understand the dynamic. They've got to try and explain things in like 30-second, 90-second, blocks in their news. And so the simplest thing, and one of the big drivers, has got to be trying to paint things in black hat, white hat terms, and gloss over complexities. And if there are things, where it gets really negative and starts to be very malign, is where you actually airbrush out things that that challenge how you've labelled stuff.
Mm.
And I've seen quite a bit of that go on in recent times. If it doesn't fit that narrative you built. And also, if you want to get a Walkley Award and you want to make an emotional pitch about something, then, you've got to find a way of making an emotional connection and sometimes exploiting it to be at the sharp and nastier end of that, but also simplifying or misconstruing something or relying on information that isn't accurate because you haven't been able to be on the ground and find out yourself to understand these things. So,
do you think we've lost some of our ability to deal with that nuance? So, like you're saying, you're presenting a certain view and you have a limited time to be able to do that, but it is a very black and white presentation. Do you think we've lost that ability a little bit in culture to have a presentation and a counter narrative to be able to weigh up whether we, like you say, just want to be black and white in our thinking? And
yeah, I think it's too important to have a proper division of labour. So it wasn't that long ago when you saw James Dibble on the news or whatever, for those who can remember that, but, where, the news was presented as known facts, certifiable facts, with no editorialising or pejorative comments attached to them. You just presented the facts. And then you had editorial programming after that where you could get opinions or you could, put forward judgments which people would then know were your views on something or whatever. Now you've seen a complete blurring of that. So I see all the time now pejorative statements made describing something which, is just, to me, that's unethical in a news broadcast.
It is.
And it becomes, and there's a creep in of infotainment sort of elements to that as well.
And we stop thinking properly, right? Like being able to weigh those things and coming to our own conclusions on things. We're having rather than informing our opinion, they're forming them.
Yeah, we love to plug into the good guy, bad guy thing, or particularly if you want to paint someone as an underdog or something and brush over things we might need to understand are not acceptable, so we really have to guard against that, and the challenge is to not creating a situation that things are so complex that you turn off the public from wanting to have any, understanding of it,
So not making them polarised in one way or the other.
Or just switching off, completely.
Yeah.
So
being disinterested.
Whatever, there's a genocide going on in Sudan or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. What can I do about it? Etc.
Becoming desensitised.
Yeah.
Yeah. So ideology is really what gets people emotionally invested in war. How do some of those strategic interests come into play?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the old obvious ones I mentioned, power and money, power and wealth. And you see that playing out particularly in the way someone like Vladimir Putin operates. So power and wealth are really everything that you need to understand about him. And then it's the way he then pursues those objectives. Given his background as a former KGB colonel, you'll see how he applies sort of rootless, amoral sort of means by which he achieves those things. But then you see that play out, so often. It's like the constant theme through history. And so a good example of that is the reporting I saw in relation to this caravan loaded with explosives and the trail of anti-Semitic attacks that were occurring and burning down synagogues and daycare centres and, graffiti, etc. And then everyone sort of said, oh, it's okay because it was just a criminal fraud. It was just someone trying to use it for personal gain. Well, that actually describes almost the entire history of anti-Semitism. People used it for a reason, Adolf Hitler to, unite people behind a scapegoat, to provide an excuse for how they lost the First World War, for him to get personal power, for all the people around him to secure personal wealth. You threw out, Jews from their property, you took it over. There were all these motivations. Some of those people, for sure, didn't believe the racial theories behind all that, but who cared? This was my chance to make a quid.
Yeah.
And so
to find a bunny to do the dirty work.
It's still anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I heard one reporter on the ABC say, it wasn't legitimate anti-Semitism. So, how does a reporter even use a phrase like that? So there's
Yeah, things
legitimate
have shifted so
anti-Semitism,
much, haven't they?
and no, it's call it out for what it is. And this figure, who's alleged to have been behind all that, was clearly doing the same as been done throughout history, exploiting it. But we know also from this person who, from his background, had given plenty of evidence of anti-Semitic views and behaviour. You know, very convenient for him to adopt that mental frame reference and exploit it for his personal gain. You know, that's how it works.
But we've lost that ability to think like, how would I feel if that was happening to me in my community? Really, it's not a complex thing to think that, well, if that was happening to us, that would be really scary and awful.
Yeah. Well, part of this is that the clue is in the name, terror.
Yeah.
You know, when we try and find definitions of terrorism, well, have a look at the people on the receiving end. How did they feel? Terrorized. You know, so sometimes that's you get a bit too technical, and sometimes you have to try and find a legal response to something. But we should actually call things out for what they are at times, and then he gets back to how do you address, you know, some of the social seed boxes for how these things happen, and how do you create, you know, the growth in the mindset through proper education of our kids, you know, and attack this othering mechanism. And so, and a lot of the conflicts that happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall really came back to ethno-nationalism, and you know, these cultural clashes of the past got
And
resurfaced
tribalism.
again, exploited
Yeah.
again by, you know, shameless political opportunists. So,
Okay. So you've studied and lived geopolitics. If we strip away all the noise, what are the fundamental forces that shape global power?
yeah, well, you know, we all look to see governments deal with national interests, but I think we understand in Australia that there are times when that national interest involves partners and coalitions to tackle global threats and challenges and evil. But at the same time, you know, your priority as a government is, yes, to look after the welfare of your own citizens. So, you know, there's a balance to be drawn there. And it becomes challenging in these autocracies where it's just not about, you know, whatever the, you know, the national benefit is, it's about personal benefit. So when a Chinese delegate stands up at the UN for China, he's not standing up for 1.4 billion Chinese, he's standing up for one person, Xi Jinping. And that's unfortunately a big dynamic that's a factor in our world at the moment.
Little people suffer.
Yeah, so it's a difficult path to navigate, but with a robust media and an accurate and fair media and good public conversation, good civil society, good culture of democracy, it helps you. It's insurance, and it's also shoring up against those things. And you see that play out in Parliament, where you could easily bring that place to a halt very quickly, even operating within the rules. But that culture of democracy makes sure that the parties, the main parties at least, I'm not sure about the Greens these days, but the main parties at least understand that you've got to hit a certain conventions to make the place operate. So that's important. That culture of democracy, what saves us from dysfunction.
Yeah, we're very blessed, aren't we? So, Mike, thank you for everything you're doing with this program. It's really is such a blessing, I think, for Australians and bringing back that civil discourse that we so desperately need in this country, and for demystifying some of these really complex issues for the everyday Australian who wants to better understand geopolitics and not necessarily just buy into that polarised view, but just bring that civil discourse back to the country. So, yeah, really looking forward to the adventure.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. And look, I'm really blessed to be working with some great people like you and with Peter Lay and Mike Jensen, who we've introduced in these intro programs, but also so many people that we'll be drawing on, wonderful Australians and international friends and colleagues. And really all we want to do is give people a basis for forming informed opinions and to fight, you know, those battles on the misinformation front, and make any contribution we can to that discourse you mentioned.
Yeah, it's a gift. Looking forward to it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week. And now we'll be starting to get into the meat of the issues that are currently confronting the world and Australia, and drawing on a lot of great expertise in helping to unravel and unpick all that. So we'll see you again next week.